30 years of marriage ended for me in a room filled with people who were pretending to be sad. I remember the moment clearly because it was the exact moment I realized something was very wrong. The lawyer had just finished reading the will, and everyone in the room slowly turned to look at me with the same expression, pity mixed with quiet curiosity. You see, after 30 years of marriage to my husband Richard Ellis, I was supposed to inherit something. At least that's what everyone assumed. But according to the document sitting on the polished mahogany table, I had been left with absolutely nothing. Not the house, not the accounts, not even the small art collection I had spent decades curating. Just 30 days to pack my belongings and leave the estate. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a few hours later, I would discover something hidden that would change everything. But before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that life can change in ways we never expect, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who understands the most. Now let me tell you how it all began. My name is Margaret Ellis. I am 66 years old, and for most of my life I worked as a cultural museum curator. I spent decades studying history, preserving artifacts, and documenting the quiet stories people often overlook. But the greatest lesson I ever learned about human nature didn't come from a museum. It came from my own family. My husband, Richard Ellis, was a powerful real estate magnate and political donor, a brilliant businessman who built an empire of luxury developments across the country. To the outside world, he was respected, admired, even feared. But at home, Richard was something else entirely. He was quiet, calculating, and often distant. When we met, I was 31 and working at a museum archive. Richard visited during a charity event, and somehow we began talking about architecture and art history. 2 years later, we were married. But Richard came with something else: his children. Jonathan Ellis, his oldest son, was 45 now and the self-appointed heir to the Ellis empire. Jonathan was a corporate executive who believed power was the only language worth speaking. From the moment Richard introduced me to him, Jonathan made it clear he did not approve of me. He believed I had manipulated his father somehow. Then there was Caroline Ellis, Richard's daughter, a socialite and charity figure who cared more about appearances than anything else in the world. Caroline had perfected the art of smiling while insulting someone at the same time. She never called me by my name. To her, I was always father's assistant who stayed too long. And finally, there was Lucas Ellis, the youngest son, 36 years old and permanently drowning in debt from reckless investments. Lucas never openly attacked me the way the others did, but he watched everything closely, always calculating how money might move through the family. For 35 years, I lived among them quietly. I attended charity events. I hosted dinners for politicians and investors. I kept Richard's reputation spotless and protected the image of the Ellis family. And through it all, I followed one simple belief that guided my life. Silence teaches you more than arguments ever will. When you stay quiet long enough, people reveal exactly who they are. That belief carried me through decades of uncomfortable dinners and polite insults. And on the morning of Richard's funeral, it helped me stay perfectly calm while everyone around me waited to see if I would break. The funeral was held in a cathedral downtown. The entire city's elite had gathered there. Politicians, business partners, developers, journalists, they all came to say goodbye to the man who built half the skyline. I sat in the front row wearing black, listening as speaker after speaker described Richard as a visionary, a titan, a builder of cities. But none of them mentioned the quiet man I knew at home, the one who would sit in his study late at night staring at financial reports with a look of deep concern on his face during the last few years of his life. Something had been worrying him, I knew that much. But Richard rarely explained his fears out loud. After the service ended, Jonathan approached me with a smile that felt rehearsed. "Margaret," he said politely, "the family will meet with the lawyer tomorrow morning for the reading of the will. You should attend." Of course I would attend. After 35 years of marriage, why wouldn't I? The next morning we gathered in the office of Samuel Carter, Richard's longtime estate attorney. Samuel was 69 years old and one of the few people in Richard's world who had always treated me with genuine respect. As everyone sat around the long conference table, I noticed something strange. Samuel looked uneasy. His usual calm professionalism seemed strained. Jonathan leaned back confidently in his chair, already acting like the new ruler of the Ellis Empire. Caroline checked her phone between sentences. Lucas stared at the table like a gambler waiting to hear the results of a risky bet, and then Samuel began reading the will. The documents were thick, filled with details about business assets, corporate shares, trusts, and properties. One by one, Richard's empire was divided among his children. Jonathan received controlling shares of the development company. Caroline inherited several luxury properties and investment accounts. Lucas received a large trust fund designed to limit his access to cash. I listened quietly, waiting for the moment when Samuel would mention the house. The estate where Richard and I had lived for 3 decades. The place I had decorated, managed, and protected like it was my life's work. Samuel finally paused and turned the page. His eyes lifted slowly toward me. And finally, he said carefully, the matter of the primary residence and the provisions regarding Margaret Ellis. The room became very quiet. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Caroline folded her arms with a faint smile. Lucas stopped tapping his fingers. Samuel cleared his throat. According to Richard Ellis' final directive, the primary residence and surrounding estate will be transferred entirely to his children. Caroline let out a small breath of satisfaction. Jonathan nodded like he had expected nothing else. Samuel continued reading. Margaret Ellis is granted 30 days to vacate the property. She may take personal belongings but no furnishings or assets from the estate. That was it. 35 years of marriage reduced to 30 days and a suitcase. I could feel every person in the room watching me, waiting for a reaction, but I remained perfectly still. Because something in Samuel's expression told me this story was not finished yet, and what he placed on the table next would change everything I thought I knew about my husband. The silence in the room after Samuel finished reading the will was heavy enough to feel like pressure in my chest. For 35 years I had been Margaret Ellis, wife of Richard Ellis, the woman who hosted dinners for governors and investors, the one who quietly managed the social side of his empire. And yet, according to the document Samuel had just read, I had been reduced to a guest who had overstayed her welcome. 30 days. That was the time I had to leave the home where I had spent half my life. Jonathan Ellis, my stepson and Richard's eldest child, leaned back in his chair looking satisfied. Jonathan had always believed the Ellis empire belonged to him. At 45, he already ran most of the company operations, and now the will had simply confirmed what he believed was his destiny. Caroline Ellis, Richard's daughter and a charity socialite who cared deeply about appearances, gave me a slow, sympathetic smile that was anything but kind. 30 days is generous, she said lightly, as if discussing the return policy on a dress. Plenty of time to find a small apartment somewhere. Lucas Ellis, the youngest son and permanently drowning in financial problems, chuckled quietly under his breath. Yeah, he added, maybe somewhere quiet. Something affordable? Their words floated around the room like dust in sunlight. I listened to them calmly. I had spent decades watching these 3 reveal their true nature whenever they thought no one important was paying attention. That was the advantage of being underestimated. People stopped hiding who they really were. Jonathan folded his hands on the table and turned toward me with a tone that tried to sound respectful but didn't quite succeed. Margaret, he said, I'm sure this is difficult, but Father structured the estate the way he believed was appropriate. I trust you'll respect his decision. I looked directly at him and nodded once. Of course, I replied quietly. Silence teaches you more than arguments ever will. There was nothing to gain from fighting them in that moment. But then something unexpected happened. Samuel Carter, Richard's estate attorney and my old friend of nearly 30 years, cleared his throat again. The movement immediately drew my attention because Samuel had not closed the folder yet. His hands were resting on something else sitting on the table. Something small, something wooden. There is one additional item, Samuel said carefully. The room shifted again. Jonathan frowned slightly. What item? Samuel slowly pushed a small cedar box across the table toward me. It was old, worn at the edges, and sealed with a simple brass latch. It looked completely out of place among the polished legal documents and expensive furniture surrounding us. Richard asked that this be given to Margaret personally, Samuel explained. He left no written explanation beyond that instruction. Caroline leaned forward with visible curiosity. What is it? She asked. Samuel shook his head. I don't know, Lucas snorted softly. Maybe it's a souvenir, he muttered. Something sentimental? Jonathan didn't laugh. Instead, he watched the box carefully as if trying to calculate its importance. Go ahead, he said to me. Open it. I placed my hand on the cedar box slowly. The wood felt cool beneath my fingers. For some reason, my heart began beating faster. Richard Ellis was not a sentimental man. He didn't give gifts without purpose. Every decision he made was deliberate. Which meant this box meant something. I lifted the brass latch and opened the lid. Inside there were only two things, a rusted iron key and a small piece of folded paper. Caroline leaned across the table trying to see inside. A key, she said in disbelief. Lucas laughed outright. That's it. I ignored them and unfolded the paper. Written on it in Richard's sharp, precise handwriting was a single address. 17 Harbor Point Road, no explanation. No instructions, just an address. Jonathan frowned. Where is that? He asked Samuel. Samuel adjusted his glasses and glanced at the paper. It's not local, he said slowly. It appears to be in Massachusetts. Caroline rolled her eyes immediately. So father left you a key to some random property, she said with a dismissive wave. Maybe a storage unit. Lucas leaned back in his chair smiling. If it's a storage unit, maybe there's something interesting inside. Jonathan studied me carefully. Well, Margaret, he said finally, whatever that is, it clearly isn't part of the estate. His tone had hardened slightly. You can take it with you when you leave. I folded the paper again and placed it back inside the cedar box. For the first time since the will had been read, something deep inside me had changed. Richard Ellis had never done anything without purpose, and he certainly hadn't hidden an address inside a wooden box without a reason. Thank you, Samuel, I said quietly, closing the lid. Jonathan stood from the table, signaling the meeting was over. That concludes everything, he said. We have business to attend to. Margaret, the 30 days begin today. Caroline stood beside him, adjusting her designer jacket. We'll have contractors visiting the house soon, she added casually. Renovations? Lucas stretched lazily in his chair. You might want to start packing. I rose slowly, holding the cedar box in my hands. For 35 years I had lived in their world. A world of wealth, power, and carefully maintained appearances. And now they believed they had removed me from it completely. But as I walked out of Samuel's office and stepped into the afternoon sunlight, I realized something important. Richard had left me nothing in the will, but he had left me something else entirely. A key, an address, and a mystery that none of them understood yet. That night I sat alone in the large bedroom that would no longer belong to me in 30 days. The cedar box rested on the table beside the bed. I opened it again and looked at the key. It was old, heavy, the kind used for doors that had existed for a very long time. I unfolded the paper again and stared at the address. 17 Harbor Point Road. Why would Richard leave me this? What could possibly be there that mattered enough for him to hide it from his own children? As those questions circled my mind, one memory from the last year of Richard's life suddenly resurfaced. One night I had found him sitting alone in his study looking through a stack of files. When I asked him what he was doing, he had closed the folder quickly and said something strange. Sometimes, Richard had told me quietly, people need protection from their own family. At the time I didn't understand what he meant, but now, holding the rusted key in my hand, I began to realize something unsettling. Richard Ellis had not been afraid of losing his empire. He had been afraid of what his own children might do after he was gone, and whatever waited at that address was something he trusted only me to find. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window of the bedroom that would soon no longer be mine, staring at the cedar box resting on the small table beside my chair. The mansion was unusually quiet. For 35 years this house had been my responsibility. I had overseen every renovation, every dinner party, every flower arrangement in the foyer. And now the silence felt different, as if the house itself knew I was leaving. I opened the cedar box again and held the rusted key in my hand. It was heavy, older than any key used in modern buildings, the kind used for doors that had been standing for generations. Beneath it was the small piece of paper with the address written in Richard's handwriting. 17 Harbor Point Road. I read the words again slowly. Harbor Point Road, Massachusetts. The location meant nothing to me. Richard and I had traveled often during our marriage. Europe, New York, California, but Massachusetts was never part of our life together, which meant something important. Richard had never wanted his children to know about that address. The next morning, I drove downtown to visit Samuel Carter. Samuel had been Richard's attorney for decades, but he had also been my friend long before I met my husband. When I walked into his office, Samuel was already waiting for me as if he expected my visit. He closed the door behind me and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "I wondered when you would come," he said gently. I placed the cedar box on the desk between us. "Samuel," I asked quietly, "did Richard ever mention this address to you?" Samuel studied the box for a long moment before answering. "No," he admitted. "Not directly?" That answer immediately caught my attention. Samuel Carter was not a careless man with words. When he said not directly, it meant he knew something. "But," I asked. Samuel leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "But during the last year of Richard's life, he asked several unusual legal questions." My heart beat a little faster. "What kind of questions?" Samuel stood up and walked toward the window before speaking again. "Questions about property ownership structures, about legal ways to keep certain assets separate from family inheritance disputes." I sat very still. "Did he own property at this address?" Samuel turned back toward me slowly. "I honestly don't know." That answer might have sounded frustrating to someone else, but to me, it confirmed something far more important. Richard Ellis had been preparing something quietly. "Margaret," Samuel continued carefully, "your husband was extremely precise when it came to legal matters. If he left you a key and an address, it was intentional." I nodded slowly. Silence teaches you more than arguments ever will. And right now, the silence around Richard's final decision was telling me everything. "Do his children know about this?" I asked. Samuel shook his head immediately. "No." A strange calm settled over me at that moment. Because if Jonathan, Caroline, and Lucas had known about the address, they would have already investigated it. Those three never ignored the possibility of hidden money, which meant I still had time. "Margaret," Samuel said gently, "what are you planning to do?" I closed the cedar box and stood up. "I'm going to find out why my husband left me a key." Samuel gave a small, approving nod. "That sounds like the right decision." Over the next few days, the atmosphere inside the mansion changed completely. Jonathan had already begun acting like the new owner. Contractors walked through the halls measuring walls and taking notes. Caroline held meetings with interior designers who spoke loudly about replacing outdated decor. One afternoon, I overheard Caroline standing in the foyer speaking with one of her friends. "30 days," she said with a laugh. "Then the house will finally look the way it should." She didn't realize I was standing at the top of the staircase listening. Lucas spent most of his time in Richard's study going through financial papers. I could see the tension in his shoulders every time he looked at the numbers. Whatever he expected to find in Richard's accounts, he clearly hadn't found it yet. And Jonathan watched me, not openly, but carefully, as if he suspected I knew something he didn't. On the 7th day after the reading of the will, I packed a small suitcase. Just enough clothes for a short trip. I placed the cedar box carefully inside my bag before leaving the house early the next morning. No one noticed me leaving, or at least, they pretended not to notice. The drive to the airport felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in decades, I was traveling without Richard, without his schedule, without the expectations of his world. I booked a flight to Massachusetts under my own name and sat quietly near the window waiting for boarding. As the plane lifted into the sky, I stared down at the shrinking city below and thought about something Richard once told me many years ago. We had been attending a political fundraiser when he leaned close and whispered something unexpected. "Margaret," he had said quietly, "the most dangerous thing in the world is a secret that only one person understands." At the time, I thought he was speaking about business deals. Now I wondered if he had been speaking about something else entirely. Several hours later, I arrived in a small coastal town north of Boston. The air smelled like salt and ocean wind. Harbor Point Road was not difficult to find. It was a narrow street near the water lined with older houses. Some were large historic homes, others were smaller cottages that looked like they had stood there for decades. My heart began beating faster as I slowed the car near the end of the road, because the numbers on the houses were getting closer. 11 Harbor Point, 13 Harbor Point, 15 Harbor Point, and finally 17 Harbor Point Road. I parked the car slowly across the street. The house in front of me was not what I expected. It wasn't a small cottage. It wasn't abandoned either. In fact, it looked well maintained. A large two-story home with wide windows facing the ocean and tall trees surrounding the property. It was quiet, almost too quiet. For several minutes I simply sat in the car staring at it, trying to understand what Richard had left behind. Then I opened my bag and removed the rusted key. My hand tightened around the cold metal because something deep in my instincts told me this was not just a house. Whatever waited inside that door was the reason Richard had trusted me instead of his own children. And as I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the front gate, I had no idea that the files hidden inside that house were about to reveal the most dangerous secrets of the Ellis family. I stood outside the gate of 17 Harbor Point Road holding the rusted key in my hand, staring at the house Richard had never mentioned in 35 years of marriage. The ocean wind moved through the tall trees surrounding the property, carrying the quiet sound of waves from somewhere beyond the houses. The place didn't look abandoned. In fact, it looked carefully maintained. The lawn was trimmed. The windows were clean. Someone had been taking care of this house, but not recently enough for the neighbors to notice anything unusual. That detail mattered to me, because Richard Ellis never bought property without purpose. I pushed the small gate open and walked slowly up the stone path toward the front porch. The house was larger than it first appeared from the street. 2 stories tall, built in an older architectural style that reminded me of homes built nearly a century ago. Wide windows faced the ocean, and the wooden porch wrapped around one side of the structure. It was quiet in a way that felt almost intentional. I stood in front of the front door for a long moment before taking the key from my pocket. Silence teaches you more than arguments ever will, and right now the silence of that house was telling me something important. Richard had hidden this place from everyone, even me. My fingers closed around the rusted key as I slid it into the old brass lock. For a second nothing happened. Then the key turned smoothly. The door unlocked with a quiet metallic click. That alone made my heart beat faster. The key might have looked old, but the lock had been maintained. Someone had kept this door ready to open. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of wood and old books. Sunlight poured through tall windows in the front room, illuminating polished floors and carefully arranged furniture. The house wasn't empty, it was fully furnished. Elegant but simple pieces filled the rooms. A sofa facing the windows, bookshelves along the walls, a large wooden table near the center of the room. Everything looked preserved, almost as if someone had been waiting for me to arrive. I slowly closed the door behind me. "Hello," I called softly. No answer. Only the quiet sound of the ocean in the distance. I walked through the first room slowly, taking in every detail the way I had spent decades examining artifacts inside museums. The house felt lived in, but not recently. Dust had begun gathering on the edges of the furniture, but the dust wasn't thick. Someone had been here not long ago. Then I saw something that made me stop completely. On the far wall of the living room hung several framed photographs. I stepped closer, and my breath caught in my throat. They were photographs of me. One showed me standing in the rose garden behind our mansion years ago. Another captured me reading in the sunroom during a quiet afternoon. Another showed me walking along the driveway carrying books. None of these photos had ever been in our house, which meant Richard had taken them privately, quietly, without ever telling me. The realization sent a strange chill through my chest. For 35 years, I believed Richard Ellis barely noticed the quiet details of life. But clearly, he had been watching more carefully than I realized. I continued walking through the house, room by room. The kitchen was modern and fully stocked. The upstairs hallway held several bedrooms, each prepared with simple bedding and clean linens. Whoever maintained this place had done so with precision. But the most important room was at the end of the hall. I knew it before I even opened the door. The moment I stepped inside, I understood exactly what Richard had built here. It was an archive. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls. File cabinets stood neatly arranged beside a large desk near the window. Hundreds of folders filled the shelves, each labeled with careful handwriting. I stepped toward the nearest cabinet slowly. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the first drawer. Inside were organized files, financial records, business reports, newspaper clippings. At first, I assumed these documents were related to Richard's business empire. But then I noticed something strange. Each folder carried a specific name, a name I recognized immediately: Jonathan Ellis. I pulled the folder out carefully and opened it. The first page inside showed bank statements. The second page contained copies of corporate transactions. The third page held legal correspondence. As I turned the pages slowly, a cold realization began forming in my mind. These were not business records. These were investigations. Every document in that folder detailed Jonathan's private financial activity over the last 10 years: offshore accounts, risky corporate deals, hidden debts carefully disguised through shell companies. Richard had been tracking everything. I closed the folder slowly and returned it to the cabinet. Then I opened the next drawer. The label on the folder inside read Caroline Ellis, my stepdaughter. Inside were photographs from charity events, travel records, credit statements, and several documents detailing expensive purchases Caroline had quietly hidden from her husband's knowledge. One document in particular caught my attention: a financial agreement showing Caroline had secretly borrowed nearly $2 million from one of Richard's corporate subsidiaries. Money that had never been repaid. My heartbeat grew heavier as I opened the final drawer. The label read Lucas Ellis. That folder was thicker than the others. Inside were records of Lucas's reckless investments, failed partnerships, gambling debts disguised as consulting fees. And one document that made my hands go completely still. Lucas owed more than $6 million to private lenders, money he had never told the family about. I sat down slowly in the chair beside the desk, staring at the stacks of files surrounding me. Richard Ellis hadn't built this house as a vacation property. He had built it as a vault filled with the truth about his own children. And suddenly his words from the last year of his life echoed clearly in my mind. Sometimes people need protection from their own family. That's when I noticed one more folder resting alone on the desk. Unlike the others, this one carried no name on the outside. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in Richard's handwriting. Margaret, if you are reading this, then my plan worked. I had to leave everything to the children in the will so they would stop looking for what truly matters. But I knew they would eventually reveal who they really are. These files are not revenge, they are protection. Because when the time comes, they will come looking for this house. And when they do, you will finally understand why I trusted you more than anyone else. I lowered the letter slowly. The quiet sound of the ocean drifted through the open window beside the desk. Richard hadn't left me money. He hadn't left me property in the will. Instead, he had left me something far more powerful: the truth. And somewhere deep inside my instincts, I knew something else was about to happen. Because the kind of secrets hidden in these files were not the kind of secrets that stayed buried forever. And sooner or later, Jonathan, Caroline, and Lucas were going to realize that the house no one knew about existed. I sat in the chair inside that quiet study for a very long time, staring at the letter Richard had written to me. Outside the open window, the Atlantic wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the distant sound of waves against the shore. But inside the room, everything felt very still. On the desk in front of me were the folders containing the secrets of Jonathan, Caroline, and Lucas. My stepchildren believed they had won. In Atlanta, they were probably celebrating the moment they pushed me out of their father's empire. But sitting there in that hidden house, I finally understood something important. Richard Ellis hadn't abandoned me, he had protected me. And more importantly, he had trusted me. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back into the folder before standing up and walking toward the window. For 35 years, I had lived beside a man who rarely explained his thoughts. Richard was brilliant when it came to business strategy, but emotionally he kept his plans hidden until the final moment. Now I understood why. Richard had been watching his own children carefully for years. And the more he watched them, the more he realized something dangerous. His empire would eventually fall into the hands of people who were not prepared to carry it responsibly. I turned back toward the desk and opened Jonathan's folder again. Jonathan Ellis, my oldest stepson, had always believed he deserved control of everything. He had built his entire identity around becoming the next leader of the Ellis empire. But the documents in that folder told a different story. Hidden loans, corporate risks, quiet attempts to manipulate company shares through offshore accounts. Jonathan wasn't building the empire, he was gambling with it. Then I looked through Caroline's folder again. Caroline Ellis lived in a world of luxury charity events and expensive galas, carefully crafting the image of a perfect social leader. But the records Richard had collected showed a pattern of secret debts, private borrowing, and questionable financial decisions made behind closed doors. And Lucas's situation was even worse. The youngest son of the Ellis family had buried himself under mountains of debt that could easily destroy him if the wrong people discovered it. Richard had documented everything: bank statements, legal records, transaction histories. Every detail was organized with the precision of a museum archive. And that detail made me pause, because the way these files were arranged reminded me of my own career. Before I married Richard, I spent decades working as a museum curator. My job was to preserve history, to protect important records so future generations could understand the truth about the past. Richard had known that about me better than anyone, which meant he hadn't chosen me by accident. He had chosen the one person who understood how dangerous the truth could be and how important it was to protect it. I closed the drawer and walked slowly through the archive room again. The shelves were filled with dozens of folders, but I noticed something else now that I had calmed down. Several files were marked with different labels: corporate partnerships, political contributions, development projects across several cities. Richard had been documenting much more than just his children's actions. He had been preserving the real story behind the Ellis empire. The deeper I looked, the clearer the picture became. Richard Ellis had built an empire that looked perfect from the outside, but inside the structure there were cracks, deals that required silence, partnerships that depended on loyalty, and children who were more interested in power than responsibility. My husband had spent the final years of his life quietly gathering the truth, not to destroy anyone, but to make sure someone responsible would have access to it when the time came. I returned to the desk and opened the drawer beneath the folders. Inside, I found several notebooks filled with Richard's handwriting, personal observations, notes about business meetings, conversations he had recorded privately after family dinners and board meetings. One sentence written near the end of the final notebook caught my attention immediately. The danger isn't that my children will inherit the empire. The danger is that they will destroy it before they understand its value. I sat back in the chair again, absorbing the meaning behind those words. Richard knew exactly what was coming. He knew Jonathan would try to take control immediately. He knew Caroline would protect her image at any cost. And he knew Lucas would eventually search for money to escape the debts he had buried himself under. And when those problems began surfacing, they would start searching for anything their father might have hidden, including this house. That realization made my next decision very clear. I picked up my phone and called the one person I trusted outside this situation. Samuel Carter answered after the second ring. "Margaret," he said, sounding slightly surprised. "Are you all right?" I walked slowly toward the window while holding the phone to my ear. "Samuel," I said quietly, "I found the house." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "And?" he asked carefully. I looked back at the desk filled with files. "Richard left something here," I said. "Something important." Samuel's voice lowered slightly. "Do you need me to come there?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "Not yet. Silence teaches you more than arguments ever will, and right now I needed to observe before taking action." "But Samuel," I continued, "there is something else I need." "What's that?" he asked. I picked up one of the notebooks from the desk. "Information about the history of this property," I said. "I want to know when Richard bought this house and why he chose this location." Samuel thought for a moment. "There is someone who might help with that," he said. "Dr. Naomi Bennett." The name sounded familiar. "She's a historian," Samuel continued, "works at the university archive nearby. She specializes in historical property records and regional history." That caught my attention immediately. A historian could help uncover the deeper story behind this place. "Can you arrange a meeting?" I asked. "Of course," Samuel replied. "I'll call her this afternoon." I thanked him and ended the call before setting the phone down on the desk again. The ocean breeze moved through the open window as I looked around the room one more time. For 35 years, I had lived quietly beside Richard Ellis, protecting his reputation and supporting the world he built. Now, standing inside the hidden house he left behind, I realized something extraordinary. My husband had not left me powerless, he had left me prepared. But the most important part of his plan had not happened yet. Because the moment Jonathan, Caroline, and Lucas discovered this house existed, they would come looking for it. And when they arrived, they would expect to find the same quiet woman they had always ignored. They had no idea that the files inside this house held the truth about every secret they were hiding. And soon, they were going to realize exactly who their father trusted the most. The next morning, the ocean was covered with a soft gray fog when I woke up inside the house at 17 Harbor Point Road. For the first time in weeks, I slept without the quiet tension that had followed me through the halls of the Ellis estate. No footsteps outside my bedroom door, no whispered conversations between Jonathan and his lawyers. Just the sound of the sea and the steady creak of an old house that had been standing long before any of us arrived. I made tea in the kitchen and carried the cup into the archive room. The files Richard had collected were still spread across the desk exactly where I had left them the night before. Jonathan's folder, Caroline's folder, Lucas's folder. 3 lives carefully documented by a father who had clearly stopped trusting his own children. But this morning, my attention wasn't on them. I was thinking about something else Samuel had said during our phone call. The historian, Dr. Naomi Bennett. At 10 o'clock that morning, Samuel called again. "I spoke with her," he said. "Dr. Bennett is curious about the address you mentioned. Apparently that property has an interesting history." That word immediately caught my attention. Interesting. "Can she meet today?" I asked. "She's available this afternoon," Samuel replied. "At the university archives." I glanced around the room again before answering. "Good," I said quietly, "because I think Richard chose this place for a reason." By early afternoon, I was driving toward the university campus located about 20 minutes from Harbor Point Road. The building housing the historical archives was old, built from dark stone with tall windows overlooking the harbor. Inside, the atmosphere felt familiar to me immediately. Shelves filled with records, quiet reading rooms, the faint smell of aged paper and ink. It reminded me of the museums where I had spent most of my professional life. A woman stood waiting near the front desk when I entered. She looked to be in her late 50s with short silver hair and sharp, observant eyes. "Margaret Ellis?" she asked. I nodded. "Dr. Naomi Bennett." She extended her hand warmly. "Samuel Carter said you might be visiting?" Her handshake was firm, confident. I immediately liked her. There was something about historians and archivists, we recognize our own kind quickly. "Thank you for meeting with me," I said. Naomi gestured toward a quiet office nearby. "Samuel mentioned you're researching a property on Harbor Point Road." Once we were seated, I placed the small paper with the address written by Richard on the table between us. Naomi looked down at it and her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That address," she said slowly, "is actually quite famous in local records." That was not the answer I expected. "Famous," I repeated. Naomi stood up and walked toward a cabinet filled with archived property maps. She pulled out a large folder and placed it on the table before opening it carefully. Inside were old photographs and maps dating back nearly 80 years. That house was originally built by a businessman named Harold Whitmore in the 1940s, she explained. Whitmore was known for documenting everything connected to his companies: financial records, legal transactions, even private correspondence. I leaned forward slightly. "That sounded very familiar," Naomi continued. "When Whitmore died, most of his files disappeared. Some historians believe he kept a private archive somewhere." My mind began connecting the pieces immediately. "You're saying the house was used as a kind of vault?" Naomi nodded slowly. "That's one theory." She flipped through several pages before pointing to another document. "The property changed owners several times after Whitmore's death. But about 15 years ago, it was quietly purchased by a private buyer through a legal trust." My heart beat a little faster. "Richard Ellis," I said softly. Naomi looked up at me with curiosity. "Your husband?" I nodded. Naomi leaned back in her chair thoughtfully. "That would make sense. The Ellis Development Company expanded heavily into this region around that time." She studied my expression carefully. May I ask why you're interested in this property? For a moment, I considered how much to tell her. But Naomi Bennett was a historian, someone who understood the importance of records and truth. Because my husband left me a key to that house, I said quietly. Naomi's eyes widened slightly. And inside, I hesitated only briefly. Inside is an archive, I replied. Naomi didn't look shocked. Instead, she looked intrigued. Then Richard Ellis understood the significance of the place, she said. The Whitmore Archive was rumored to contain decades of financial documentation about powerful businesses in this region. I felt a small chill run through my chest. Because Richard hadn't just chosen a random property, he had chosen a house already known for protecting secrets. Naomi tapped the edge of the map thoughtfully. But there's something else, she added. I looked at her. What do you mean? She turned another page, revealing a more recent property record. Whoever owns that house now is listed as a private beneficiary under the trust Richard Ellis established. I blinked in surprise. A beneficiary? Naomi pointed to the name printed on the record, Margaret Ellis. For a moment the room felt completely silent. Richard had not only hidden the house from his children. He had legally placed it under my ownership long before his death. Naomi studied my expression carefully. I'm guessing you didn't know that? I slowly shook my head. That meant something extremely important. Jonathan and the others had no legal claim to the property at all, and they had no idea the house even existed. Naomi closed the file and looked at me seriously. Margaret, she said gently, if your husband stored important records there, you should protect them carefully. I nodded slowly, because I was beginning to understand something Richard had predicted. Secrets have a way of surfacing. And when they do, people start searching. As I drove back toward Harbor Point Road later that afternoon, the fog had lifted and the ocean stretched wide and bright beneath the sunlight. But something inside me had shifted. Richard hadn't just left me evidence about his children. He had placed me in control of something much larger. And somewhere in Atlanta, Jonathan Ellis was beginning to realize that something about his father's will didn't add up. Because when powerful people feel the ground shifting beneath them, they start looking for what's missing. And soon, someone in that family was going to start searching for the one place Richard Ellis had hidden from all of them. The house at 17 Harbor Point Road. 3 days after I met Dr. Naomi Bennett, the quiet rhythm of life at 17 Harbor Point Road began to change. Until that moment, the house had felt like a sanctuary. The ocean breeze moved gently through the open windows, and the silence gave me time to study the files Richard had left behind. But silence teaches you more than arguments ever will, and when silence suddenly disappears, it usually means someone has started asking questions. I was in the archive room late that afternoon reviewing another set of Richard's notebooks when my phone rang. The name on the screen was Samuel Carter. I answered immediately. Margaret, Samuel said, his voice unusually serious. I believe Jonathan Ellis is starting to investigate something. I leaned back in the chair slowly. What kind of investigation? Samuel hesitated for a moment before replying. He contacted my office this morning asking whether Richard had any undisclosed properties. That made perfect sense. Jonathan Ellis had spent his entire life assuming he knew every part of his father's empire. The idea that something might exist outside his control would bother him more than anything. What did you tell him? I asked calmly. Samuel gave a quiet sigh. I told him the truth, that the will contains no additional property records. That answer bought me time. But not much, because Jonathan was not the type of man who accepted uncertainty. He hunted it down. Margaret, Samuel continued carefully, Jonathan also hired a private investigator last week. I wasn't surprised. In fact, I had expected it. Then it won't be long before they find Harbor Point Road, I said quietly. The line went silent for a moment. You sound very calm about that, Samuel replied. I looked across the room at the shelves of files Richard had built his plan around. Because Richard expected this, I said. He knew they would come looking. After the call ended, I sat in the quiet room thinking about what would happen next. Jonathan would investigate property records. Caroline would search social networks and financial filings. Lucas would follow the money wherever it might be hidden, and eventually they would arrive here, not because they cared about the truth, but because they believed there must be something valuable inside this house. 2 mornings later, I woke early and walked outside onto the porch facing the ocean. The air was cold and clear. Seagulls drifted above the water while waves rolled steadily against the shore. For a moment, everything felt peaceful again, until I saw the black SUV slowly driving down Harbor Point Road. It moved slowly past the neighboring houses before stopping directly across the street. I already knew who it was before the doors opened. Jonathan stepped out first, dressed in the same sharp business suit he wore to board meetings. Caroline followed, her sunglasses hiding most of her expression. Lucas climbed out last, looking slightly nervous as he scanned the quiet neighborhood. I stood still on the porch watching them approach the gate. None of them had expected to see me there. Jonathan's expression shifted immediately from confidence to something else. Surprise. "Margaret," he said when they reached the walkway. "What a coincidence." Caroline removed her sunglasses slowly. "We were just passing through the area," she added casually. Lucas didn't speak at all. He kept staring at the house behind me. Silence teaches you more than arguments ever will. And in that moment, the silence between the three of them told me everything. They already suspected something important was here. Jonathan walked closer to the steps of the porch. "Interesting property," he said while studying the structure. "How did you find it?" I folded my hands calmly in front of me. "Richard left me a key." That answer immediately changed the atmosphere. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. Caroline crossed her arms. Lucas looked even more uneasy. "Father never mentioned this place," Jonathan said carefully. "He didn't mention many things," I replied. Caroline stepped forward next. "Margaret," she said with a forced smile, "if this house was purchased during Father's lifetime, it may legally belong to the Ellis estate." I almost smiled at that. "Actually," I said gently, "the property was placed under my ownership years ago." That statement hit them like a sudden gust of wind. Jonathan's eyes narrowed immediately. Lucas shifted his weight nervously. Caroline's confident posture faded slightly. "That's impossible," Jonathan said quietly. "Richard would never transfer a property without informing his family." I stepped aside slightly, revealing the open front door behind me. "You're welcome to come inside," I said. They hesitated only briefly before climbing the steps onto the porch. The moment they stepped into the archive room, the entire situation changed. Because the shelves of files were impossible to ignore, Jonathan stopped walking immediately when he saw the rows of labeled folders. Caroline stared at the cabinets in confusion. Lucas looked like someone who had just realized he had stepped into a courtroom without a lawyer. I walked slowly toward the desk and picked up one of the folders. "Richard spent many years collecting these," I said calmly. Jonathan moved closer, his eyes scanning the labels. Then he saw the name on one of the folders, his name, Jonathan Ellis. His expression went completely still. "What is this?" he asked. I opened the folder and placed the documents on the desk in front of him. "Your father's records," I replied quietly. Caroline rushed toward the desk and grabbed another folder. Her face turned pale when she saw the photographs and financial documents inside. Lucas looked at his own file and slowly sat down in the nearest chair. The room filled with a silence far heavier than anything that had happened in Atlanta. Jonathan finally spoke again. "You're planning to use these against us," he said quietly. I shook my head slowly. "No," they all looked at me in confusion. "Your father didn't collect these files for revenge," I continued. "He collected them because he understood something important about all of you." Jonathan's voice was barely above a whisper. "What?" I closed the folders and placed them back on the desk. "That one day you would come looking for something you believed belonged to you." Caroline stared at the files again. Lucas rubbed his forehead nervously, and Jonathan finally understood the situation they had walked into. Because the truth was now sitting in front of them, and it wasn't in their control anymore. But the most important decision was still ahead. Because in that moment, they didn't know whether I intended to destroy them or give them one final chance to change. When the three of them sat in that room surrounded by the files Richard had left behind, the silence felt heavier than anything I had experienced during the weeks after his funeral. Jonathan stood beside the desk, his hands resting against the wood as he stared at the folder containing his name. Caroline remained frozen near the cabinet shelves, still holding the documents she had opened earlier. Lucas sat quietly in the chair, looking down at the floor as if he already understood that something far larger than money had just been revealed. I watched them carefully. For 35 years, I had lived in their father's world. I had seen how power changed people. I had seen how silence allowed people to become careless. And now, standing in that archive room, I finally understood why Richard had chosen me to inherit this place. Jonathan broke the silence first. His voice was calm, but the tension behind it was impossible to miss. "You've been planning this," he said quietly. "You and Father." I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied. "Richard planned this long before his health began to fail." Caroline finally spoke next. "So what is this supposed to be?" she demanded. "Insurance?" I walked toward the window where the ocean stretched across the horizon. The waves moved steadily, the same way they had for generations before any of us existed. "Your father understood something about all three of you," I said. "Something he didn't know how to fix." Lucas finally looked up at me. "And what was that?" he asked quietly. I turned back toward them. "That power without responsibility eventually destroys itself." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Caroline looked away. Lucas leaned back slowly in his chair. Because even though they didn't want to hear it, every one of them knew exactly what I meant. I walked back toward the desk and opened one of the folders again. Inside were documents Richard had collected over nearly 10 years. Financial reports, emails, contracts, evidence of mistakes and decisions none of them had expected their father to notice. "Your father built an empire," I said calmly. "But near the end of his life, he realized something troubling." Jonathan folded his arms. "Which was?" I met his eyes directly. "That the people he planned to leave it to might destroy it within a few years." That sentence landed harder than anything else I had said. Jonathan's confidence cracked slightly. Caroline's expression shifted from anger to uncertainty. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck nervously. Jonathan spoke again, his voice quieter now. "And what does this have to do with you?" I closed the folder gently. "Richard didn't trust himself to confront you," I said. "He spent years protecting this family's reputation. He thought if he revealed what he knew, the damage would destroy everything." Caroline scoffed lightly. "So instead he handed it to you?" I nodded. "Yes." Lucas looked up again. "Why?" For a moment I didn't answer. Instead I walked slowly toward the bookshelf where the last envelope Richard had left behind rested between two binders. I picked it up and placed it on the desk. The envelope had been sealed when I first arrived at the house, but I had opened it the night before. Inside was a final letter written in Richard's handwriting. I slid the paper toward Jonathan, because he believed I would make the decision he never could. Jonathan unfolded the letter slowly. The room grew silent again as his eyes moved across the page. Caroline stepped closer to read over his shoulder. Lucas leaned forward in his chair. When Jonathan finished reading, he lowered the letter carefully back onto the desk. His expression had completely changed. Because the final words Richard had written were simple but impossible to misunderstand. "Margaret will decide whether the Ellis name deserves to survive." Caroline's voice trembled slightly when she spoke next. "So what happens now?" I looked at each of them carefully. For the first time since they arrived, none of them looked arrogant. None of them looked certain. They looked like people who had just realized that their future depended on someone they had spent years dismissing. Silence teaches you more than arguments ever will, and the silence in that room told me something important. They finally understood the position they were in. I walked toward the archive cabinets and closed the drawer containing the files. "Nothing happens today," I said calmly. Jonathan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I turned back toward them. "Your father left these records with me for one reason," I explained. "To protect what he spent his life building." Caroline crossed her arms. "And if we don't meet your expectations?" I met her gaze directly. "Then the world will learn exactly how the Ellis Empire really operated." Lucas exhaled slowly. Jonathan looked at the shelves again, realizing the full weight of what was stored in that room. After a long moment, he nodded once. "I understand," he said quietly. That was the first honest thing Jonathan Ellis had said since walking into the house. They left about 10 minutes later. No arguments, no threats, just quiet footsteps moving down the hallway toward the front door. When the black SUV finally disappeared down Harbor Point Road, the house returned to the peaceful silence I had felt when I first arrived. I walked back into the archive room and sat at the desk. The files remained locked safely in the cabinets. not as weapons, but as reminders. Richard had built his entire life protecting an empire, but in the end, he had realized something most powerful men learn too late. Empires do not survive because of money, they survive because someone is willing to guard the truth behind them. I stood and walked onto the porch facing the ocean. The evening sun reflected across the water, turning the waves gold. Somewhere far away, Jonathan, Caroline, and Lucas were driving back toward the city, carrying the knowledge that the one person they had spent decades underestimating now held the future of everything their father built. And as the wind moved across the quiet shoreline, I finally understood the real reason Richard had left me the key to this house. He hadn't just given me a hidden property. He had given me the one thing none of them ever expected me to have, the final word.